not prevent people with disabilities from having a voice in the legislative process. The bottom line is that a modern Congress is one that welcomes and accommodates every American. Making Congress more accessible to persons with disabilities is a process. And today, we are joined by a panel of experts who are going to help us understand why investing in this process is so important. I'm looking forward to hearing their recommendations for what Congress can do better. And I'd like to now invite Vice Chair Timmons to share some opening remarks as well.
Hey, good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I would like to especially thank Congressman Langevin for taking time out of his busy schedule to speak with us. Over the last several hearings this committee has held, we have focused a lot on staff capacity and how to recruit and retain a talented and diverse workforce to make Congress work better for the American people. As I said last week, when we talk about modernizing Congress, we were talking about investing in and developing a diverse workforce that accurately reflects the communities we represent. This includes a very important community, those with disabilities. At each step in the public policymaking process here in the House, our constituents can actively participate, whether it be meeting with members on specific issues, attending committee hearings, or watching debate and votes on the House floor. Or, as we have seen over the last year, constituents can participate in this process virtually. However, there remains a real challenge to many Americans when it comes to engaging in the legislative process. Part of this committee's mission is making Congress more effective and efficient on behalf of the American people. This includes ensuring that those with disabilities can actively participate in the policymaking process. The United States Capitol is more than 200 years old. Aside from being located on a hill, which presents natural challenges, there are other obvious physical barriers as well. Narrow halls and doorways, steep, winding steps. There remain other challenges for those with disabilities. Those who are blind or visually impaired may not be able to access information from congressional websites. And those who are deaf or hard of hearing are not able to follow live committee hearings when there is no closed captioning available. On that note, I'm pleased that in today's important hearing, we are able to provide closed captioning for those watching. I'm looking forward to our discussion today about ways that we can improve accessibility in the House and make Congress work better for our constituents. A modern Congress is one that is accessible to and accommodates all Americans. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair Timmons. Today, we're joined by several expert witnesses. Witnesses are reminded that your oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes, and without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. Our first witness today is our colleague, Representative Jim Langevin, who serves as co-chair of the Bipartisan Disability Caucus. Mr. Langevin, we may have to invite you back for our hearing on cybersecurity later in the year, but we're thrilled you could join us this morning, and you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to recognize you and the ranking member. Thank you for holding this hearing, and I'm honored to be here to contribute my thoughts. So, as well as the entire Modernization Committee, I just want to recognize you all for the work you're doing, and thank you for having me. So, as many of you know, I am the first quadriplegic to serve as a member of Congress, and as a founding co-chair of the Bipartisan Disabilities Caucus. Accessibility of the Capitol complex has always been a priority for me, because the hallowed halls of Congress are where visitors from all across the country come to interact with their representatives, listen to political discourse, and track legislation that can significantly impact their lives and their livelihoods. So today, I'm going to briefly touch on 3 areas where I believe we can improve, the first of which is physical accessibility. So physical accessibility of the Capitol complex is something that I think about daily, not by choice, but really out of necessity. The architect of the Capitol staff, I have to say, have always worked with me to remove barriers, with no better example than their efforts to install a lift system on the House floor at the Speaker's rostrum to make the Speaker's rostrum accessible. However, physical barriers in the Capitol, such as inadequate signage, lack of accessible bathrooms, and improper curb cuts, and also lack of things like automatic door openers still remain. And the fact that I'm reminded of whenever there's a joint hearing in a room that I'm not familiar with, and obviously the accessibility challenges come up, obviously, once again. So we need to ensure that the Office of Congressional Workplace Rights completes timely biennial ADA inspection reports and as required by Congressional Accountability Act. We also need to improve funding to remove barriers identified in those reports so that we can guarantee that constituents and advocates who travel great distances to make their voices heard can actually enter the room to do so. Accessible communication is another area where the House, I believe, could be doing better. In an ideal world, each hearing, briefing, press conference, or other event would have communications access, real-time translation or CART, as it's known, services, or sign language interpreters provided. However, these services are generally utilized only upon request, and when requested, staff often don't know where to go to ensure that they are provided. Additionally, we must continue working to bring congressional websites up to date with accessibility standards, which requires two main components. That's accessible website design and uploading content in accessible formats. So, which brings me to to the third area, and that's staff training. So many House staff are simply not familiar with disability rights or accessibility services and procedures. So by requiring staff to have accessibility training, we can help press staff put out communications in an accessible manner, enable administrative staff to handle internal and external accommodation requests properly, and ensure staff with disabilities know where to request an accommodation without fear of it impacting their job. The bottom line is that we must continue working to weave accessibility into the foundation of the House of Representatives instead of remedying accessibility concerns only when they're brought to our attention. If we focus on the three areas that I've discussed: physical accessibility, accessible communications, and staff training, we can, I believe, make great progress as an organization. I appreciate the progress that we've made so far, but clearly more can be done and needs to be done, and I hope we can get there together. So with that, I appreciate your time, and I look forward to working with you towards a more inclusive House. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Congressman Langevin. I want to be sensitive to your time. I don't know if you're able to stand for any questions or if you got a dash.
Sure, I have time for a couple if there are any.
Let me just ask members of the committee any questions for Congressman Langevin. Go ahead, Vice Chair Timmons.
Congressman Langevin, thank you so much. If there was one, your number one issue that needs to be changed on the Hill, what would it be?
So, as I mentioned, the access to interpreters or real-time broadcasting of the translation of what's said at the hearings would be important. The other thing is the automatic door openers. As you and I both know, those doors can be quite heavy. Some of them are at offices, but some of them were designed to be basically fire doors. If they're not open, and for example, and I don't have somebody with me, that there's no way I'm opening that door and getting through it. And so if it's happening to me, it's happening to members of the general public if they're trying to navigate the Capitol complex themselves. But also, again, highlighting the staff training is really important. Just knowing where to turn and know that there are resources out there and they can get help. But think of just maybe the interns that answer the phone or the staff assistants that are handling the calls that come into the office. If there's turnover and they haven't been trained or informed that these services even exist, how are they going to tell the public about it?
Sure, no, thank you so much. We'll do everything we can to get on top of that.
Thank you for the question, though, Vice Chair Timmons.
Mr. Perlmutter, did I see you have a hand up? And I saw you, Mr. Davis.
I just wanted to thank the gentleman from Rhode Island for his testimony today and for being a champion on this subject, both for himself, but for the disability community as a whole. And so I don't have any questions. I always look to Jim for advice on this subject and many others. So thanks for his testimony.
Thank you.
Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And hey, Jim, you know, I've always wanted to question you. So I hope you don't mind a few off-topic questions. But hey, in all seriousness, I want to know, are you getting contacted by the architect of the Capitol on a regular basis or their employees about suggestions and upgrades that still may need to be done around the Capitol? And also, can you, you know, what is the next, besides the automatic door openers, when you look at the outer grounds, what do you think needs to be done next to help the disability community and you know, those like yourself that, you know, as we see an ever growing number of those who are disabled get elected to Congress too?
Yeah, so thanks for the question, Rodney. And yeah, we have pretty good communications with the architect of the Capitol's office, and you know, by and large, they've been very responsive. I think, you know, things have just taken a lot longer to get where we need to get. I kind of joked around that, well, and it was reality that when I first got to Congress, basically they were in the process of this process of renovating the committee rooms and subcommittee rooms, and so basically they would make accessible those committees that I was assigned to, and so of course I said, well, maybe I should, as a freshman, get on the appropriations committee then, and they can make that one accessible first. But really, that's what they were doing, is, you know, kind of going room by room, hearing room by hearing room. So it was helpful, and it got the job done. And you know, they continue to progress. I don't think all the committee rooms are done yet in terms of making the rosters accessible, but they're getting there. So it's just, you know, accelerating that timeline. And I'm trying to think of the outside the complex. It's more there's curb cuts that, you know, either in more curb cuts are needed in certain places. They may not be in the right spot, and so, you know, you've got to go way down somewhere to actually find the curb cut and then come all the way back. I mean, at least the curb cut is there, so that's one good thing. But you know, when it becomes, you know, owners to kind of go out of your way to get to one, and, you know, waste time. We all know that time is precious on the Hill, and so that's just one of a couple of things that come to mind. But you know, I do give a lot of credit to the architect of the Capitol's office. They have been, you know, very receptive from the very beginning. You know, it's just one of those things that's, you know, you can only get to so many things. I suppose we just need to accelerate the timeline.
Well, thanks, Jim. I appreciate it. And keep in touch if you have any suggestions on curb cuts that we might be able to be helpful with.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Thank you.
See you,
Mr.
man.
Langevin, do you have time for one more?
Sure, if we could do one more, that would be great.
You bet. Mr. Phillips.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Mr. Langevin, in 2 years in Congress, I've never said I would like to associate myself with someone's remarks, but today I'm going to do so. I want to associate myself with everybody's remarks. Gratitude to you for your testimony and your service in Congress. I know how tough it must be here, and I want to attract more of the best and brightest of all capabilities and physical abilities. And I wonder, based on your perception, is there a sense in the disabled community in the country that Congress is inaccessible physically and otherwise? And if so, is there anything that we can do beyond the physical improvements to the complex that might make this a more welcoming place?
Yeah, and so the Office of Accessibility Services, I think it's a really important office, and we want to make sure that word gets out there about them. There are disability advocate organizations that I'm involved with, National Organization on Disability, for example, and they're, in addition to accessibility suggestions that they make, they also, obviously, there are things that they look to see being done to make society in general more accessible, and being able to, you know, live in the community. The Supreme Court Olmstead decision, for example, that, you know, people with disabilities have a right to live actively, independently in their communities. We haven't quite reached that goal yet as a country, but it is a worthy goal that, you know, I'm bound to determine in my time in Congress to see us get closer to achieving. It just, you know, it just takes time and effort, and we need to keep pushing the envelope.
I appreciate that. I just want to my colleagues, we've spoken a lot about interns, and I think we can make a special effort to attract interns with physical disabilities to Congress to create a pipeline, something I think we could give a little bit of attention to.
Thank you for that comment. By the way, you are spot on that comment. The one thing that is always a challenge is finding that pipeline and having people with disabilities know that they are welcome to apply for the job and hopefully actually get the job. But there doesn't seem to be that pipeline that we would hope for. And I think the intern program is a great way to do that. First of all, it allows someone with a disability to kind of get a feel for the job and say, hey, yeah, this is something that I can do and that I like. And it allows the potential employer to see what reasonable accommodations are all about. And it's not onerous accommodations, it's reasonable accommodations. And so just a thought that you raised a very good point. I wanted to associate myself with your remarks. So thank you.
Right back at you, and good to see you. Thanks so much.
You too.
Mr. Langevin, you have been very generous with your time and with your expertise, and I just want to thank you for your partnership to this committee and for your leadership on these issues. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. I look forward to further discussions on the topic and others.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
With that, we are next joined by Phoebe Ball. Ms. Ball serves as Disability Counsel on the House Education and Labor Committee. She has spent her professional career working on issues related to disability law and is a published policy researcher in the areas of employment, asset development, work incentives, self-determination, and benefit programs for individuals with disabilities, and has gained a national reputation as an expert in the area of guardianship. Ms. Ball was a staff attorney with Disability Rights Florida for 7 years, moved to the Washington, D.C. area in 2014 to become the Legislative Affairs Specialist with the National Council on Disability, an independent federal agency that advises the President, Congress, and other federal officials and entities on policies and programs affecting Americans with disabilities. Ms. Ball left NCD to join the staff of the Ed and Labor Committee in 2019 and frequently meets with stakeholders and advocates on issues related to disability policy. Ms. Ball, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Thank you so much, Chairman Kilmer. Good morning, everyone, and Vice Chair Timmons and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you so much for having me here today to offer my perspective on the accessibility of Congress. Although I'm currently working from home, I've spent a great deal of time navigating the halls of Congress and the House and Senate office buildings. In addition to my experiences as a wheelchair user, I also have several hidden disabilities that both inform my work on disability policy and occasionally necessitate accommodations to enable me to succeed in my work. Providing physical and programmatic access, reasonable workplace accommodations, and engaging with staff and members of the public with disabilities in ways that are respectful, open, inclusive, and offer a safe work environment are the keys to ensuring that Congress is accessible to people with disabilities, whether they are staffers, members of the public, or members of Congress. The work of Congress takes place in buildings that were designed and built long before the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. There's a reason that the image of disabled activists crawling up the Capitol steps resonated so deeply with the American people and led to the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It was a visual demonstration of how we have been barred from participating in society and the democratic process. While my office and the common spaces where the Ed and Labor Committee staff work are all accessible, there are still many challenges that are largely the result of working in buildings that predate the ADA. Getting from one building to another through a series of tunnels that connects the House and Senate office buildings is especially challenging. After 5 months on the job, I was just starting to learn the route from my office in Rayburn to the Senate buildings, where I frequently met with Senate colleagues. This route involved several elevators, including at least one freight elevator, a sloping hall that was great fun in a manual wheelchair, and a nifty subway that is only accessible on the Senate side. It also involved a treasure hunt of sorts, following signs that said accessible route to the Senate. These were helpful, but definitely could be bigger and easier to follow. For the first few months, I got turned around a lot, including a few minutes in a hallway that I'm pretty sure was haunted. While I acknowledge and appreciate the efforts of the architect of the Capitol to mark accessible paths, better signage is still needed in some areas regarding accessible paths, exits, and critically, directions to accessible bathrooms. As renovations occur, wherever possible, barriers should be removed and individuals who use wheelchairs can get from point A to point B using the same pathways as our non-disabled colleagues. Bathrooms should be renovated to ensure that there is at least one accessible stall in every bathroom and that other ADA compliant features are in place. I'd like to take a minute to talk about doors. Representative Langevin already referenced this, but these can be a real barrier for a wheelchair user. The double leaf doors are only wide enough for a wheelchair when both are open, and at least one able-bodied and tall person needs to work several latches to open both doors. These doors need to be altered so that both doors open easily, preferably automatically. Getting out the door in an emergency is equally important. Staff and members with disabilities need to be at the table making emergency management plans, and staff need to know how to interact with the public and have training so that they can assist people with disabilities in emergencies. Learning how to talk about disability can help break down barriers too. While there's a diversity of opinion on how we speak about disability, I prefer to use identity-first language. I am a disabled woman, not a person with a disability who happens to be a woman. Both disabled and women are essential to my identity. Some people use person-first language, and that's fine too. What are not fine are euphemisms, including differently abled, special needs, and outdated terms such as handicaps. There are also attitudinal barriers. I have sometimes been greeted by congressional staff with panic, obvious discomfort, and occasionally condescension. Whether these barriers are intentional or unintentional, they are unacceptable, and some basic disability awareness training can help, as long as the training doesn't include disability simulations, which can reinforce stereotypes. Luckily, the Committee on Education and Labor was very aware of the need to make my office and common spaces accessible. This should be the experience of all staff with disabilities, who must have options among a range of office equipment and furniture that will meet their access needs. As Representative Langevin said, public events such as hearings and markups need to be accessible, particularly to the deaf community. Websites are public spaces and need to meet 508 and web content accessibility guidelines and use plain language whenever possible, which will make websites more usable by intellectually disabled members of the public and everyone else. As remote work is likely to be an important option even after this pandemic finally ends, especially as an accommodation for staff with disabilities, remote platforms need to be accessible. I also would just like to mention that it's really important to remember that accommodations need to be made for folks with mental health disabilities as well. I was recently diagnosed with depression, and I have a learning disability and several other hidden disabilities. And it needs to be, managers and supervisors need to understand that they need to make accommodations to these types of disabilities in addition to the visible disabilities. Congress is a high-pressure environment where the American people must come first, but the ADA doesn't require a fundamental alteration of that dynamic. But barriers to access, denials of reasonable accommodation, and ignorant or disrespectful attitudes about disability should never be tolerated and are impediments to recruiting and retaining a diverse congressional workforce. The mission of this committee is more important than ever as we consider whether we are just going to return to business as usual or if we're going to make the People's House work better for everyone. Thank you so much, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Ms. Ball. Our next witness is Heather Ansley. Ms. Ansley is Associate Executive Director at the Paralyzed Veterans of America. She also works to promote collaboration between disability organizations and veterans service organizations by serving as a co-chair of the Consortium for Citizens with Disabilities Veterans Task Force. Additionally, she serves as an officer for CCD's Board of Directors. Prior to joining PVA, Ms. Ansley served as Vice President of Vets First, a program of United Spinal Association, and as the Director of Policy and Advocacy for the Lutheran Services in America Disability Network. Ms. Ansley, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Chair Kilmer, Vice Chair Timmons, and members of the Select Committee, Paralyzed Veterans of America, or PVA, would like to thank you for the opportunity to testify today regarding our views on ways to improve disability access to the facilities and activities of the House of Representatives. PVA is a congressionally chartered veteran service organization whose members are all veterans who have acquired a spinal cord injury or disorder, and the overwhelming number of them use assistive devices for mobility, such as wheelchairs, scooters, and canes. Having the opportunity to participate in visits with members of Congress, testify before congressional committees and roundtables, and attend hearings and briefings, whether in person or on Capitol Hill, is an important part of our democracy. For veterans, including those who have incurred disabilities as a result of their service to our nation in the protection of our freedoms, ensuring that disability is not a barrier to participating in their government is an important duty of Congress. If all people with disabilities do not have proper access to their legislators, policies will not effectively reflect their needs and perspectives. Barriers to Capitol Hill can start at the curb. Providing a designated drop-off or pickup zone near any accessible entrances would help to mitigate this barrier and also help people with disabilities to more easily identify the accessible building entrances and paths of travel. The next barrier is often transiting security. Prior to the pandemic, the security process for wheelchair users was at times inconsistent. Consistent security procedures must be developed, and screening officers must be trained on proper procedures to ensure that visitors receive a fair screening that meets the security needs of Capitol Hill. Once through security, navigating a House office building can be difficult due to the lack of signage to guide people with disabilities. Improved signage that clearly identifies the accessible path of travel for people who use mobility devices would help them to be able to more easily locate offices and committee rooms. Also, elevators can be quite small and not fully accessible to those who use wheelchairs and scooters. Additional signage would help to steer them to bigger elevators that can more easily accommodate devices, particularly for people who use large power chairs. Also, when renovations are made, small elevators should be replaced. According to advocates for people who are blind or low vision, Braille signage is falling into disrepair and needs to be maintained. In addition, these advocates believe that Congress should continue providing services like ARIA, which was previously provided for free to users in the various buildings on Capitol Hill. This was helpful to travel successfully from office to office. Once arriving at a member's office, additional barriers often make entering and navigating them difficult. Offices are often small and do not always allow easy access for people who use mobility devices. Each congressional office should be modified to include push-button access, particularly for those located in Rayburn. Office layouts should also be developed with a consideration of the needs of visitors and staff with disabilities who use assistive devices when feasible. Members of their Congress and their staff should also provide more information about how to access their offices and request accommodation. For example, when individuals identify as using a wheelchair, staff should proactively move furniture if needed and ensure entrance door access. Staff should also develop and use checklists to ensure access to all of the events that they hold, and additionally should develop plans for detailing how they're going to address accessibility needs before those requests arise. Training should also be provided to congressional staff about how to interact with people who do not use speech to communicate or who appear to behave in a non-typical manner. Providing initial and ongoing training for staff about how to interact with constituents and advocates with disabilities, including those with non-apparent disabilities, will help to ensure equal access for all. Accessing the services available to the general public in House office buildings can also be difficult. Restrooms are not universally accessible for people who use mobility devices, and all restrooms should be renovated to provide at least one wheelchair accessible stall. In addition, family restrooms would help those with disabilities who may require assistance. Finally, the pandemic fundamentally changed the way that constituents and advocates have interacted with Capitol Hill. In-person meetings, hearings, roundtables, and briefings transformed to virtual events. The ability to participate virtually in these events has expanded the ability of people with disabilities to more easily participate. As the nation emerges from the pandemic, PVA believes that continued avenues for virtual participation in events is needed to ensure full access to the legislative process for people with disabilities who may experience travel, physical, and/or monetary barriers. Thank you for the opportunity to submit our views on improving access. We look forward to answering any questions.
Thanks so much, Ms. Ansley. Our next witness is Judy Brewer. Ms. Brewer directs the Web Accessibility Initiative at the World Wide Web Consortium. She's also a principal research scientist at MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab. Her work includes coordinating the development of accessibility standards, guidelines, and best practices for digital technologies, including the web, mobile, digital publishing, virtual reality, and other technologies that are converging on the web. Ms. Brewer's current interests include expanding access to digital accessibility for people in under-resourced regions and communities around the world, and exploring the potential of virtual meetings and gatherings to improve connections between people with disabilities and others. Ms. Brewer, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. To the Honorable Chair Kilmer and Vice Chair Timmons and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to speak with you about the importance of digital accessibility in modernizing Congress. I direct the Web Accessibility Initiative, WAI, at the WAI, at the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C, the international standards body for the web. We're headquartered at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I have been working on accessibility for over 3 decades as a technology expert, as well as a person with a disability. My oral testimony summarizes my written testimony. Digital accessibility is the design of technologies so that people with disabilities can use them along with everyone else, whether their disabilities are auditory, cognitive, neurological, physical, speech, or visual. The scope and impact is broad. Digital accessibility enables constituents who are blind to find and comment on legislation that you're developing. It enables a staff member experiencing stress to smoothly navigate to a secure and private telehealth session. It enables a congressperson who is hard of hearing to follow witnesses' testimony via streaming captions in a video conference. It could allow students who are deaf or have low vision or difficulty with hand coordination to take a virtual tour of the US Capitol with their classmates. We count on accessibility thanks to the 30-year-old Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA. It's timely for congressional attention, given that the pandemic has accelerated society's move from physical to virtual. COVID has at the same time put the digital disability divide into sharp relief. The accepted worldwide standard for web accessibility is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG, WCAG, which also sets a foundation for accessibility of mobile, publishing, and more. WCAG is developed by the Web Accessibility Initiative at W3C with extensive contributions from industry, research, people with disabilities, and government. It's incorporated into Section 508 and cited for conforming to the ADA. WAI also develops authoritative educational, explanatory, and technical materials for implementing WCAG. This work is supported in part by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, Rehabilitation, and Research, the Department of Health and Human Services, the European Commission, Ford Foundation, WAI sponsors, and W3C member organizations. My remarks today are my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of WAI's funders. A vibrant and extensive business sector has evolved to address the need for development and evaluation of accessible digital technologies. Practical and operational issues in large decentralized organizations require a comprehensive and methodical approach. There is no silver bullet. The 116th Congress resolution on modernizing Congress called for accessibility assessment of all House websites and apps. This is an important first step. It is also important to build awareness, set a centralized policy, select tools carefully, and conduct ongoing monitoring. Examples of issues and approaches include, it's important that documents be produced in accessible formats. Legacy documents may need significant remediation. It's important that tools for producing documents and websites are usable by staff with disabilities. Tools that conform to a different standard, the authoring tool accessibility guidelines, ATAG, ensure that they can be used by people with disabilities and that they support production of accessible content. Accessible templates and business processes for websites and applications, and training, including for non-technical staff writers, help achieve accessibility. Procurement approaches from Section 508 of the Workforce Investment Act can help set clear expectations with vendors. Turning back to the circumstances that are causing us to have a virtual rather than in-person hearing today, the pandemic has hit racial, cultural, and disability communities in a devastating way. It's more important than ever that we have equal opportunity to comment into public processes that impact our lives. Everyone had to pivot to virtual modes with little preparation. People with disabilities had to pivot in especially difficult ways. We are now seeing progress through innovation driven by necessity. People with disabilities do not want to lose this virtual access that has opened new doors during this difficult time. WAI is developing best practices to address accessibility of virtual as well as hybrid events that are both in-person and virtual in the future. I encourage Congress to support this emerging area of accessibility. It's heartening to learn of interest by the Bipartisan Select Committee on Modernization. Thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Brewer. And our final witness is John Ulman. Mr. Ulman serves as General Counsel of the Office of Congressional Workplace Rights, where he previously held the positions of Acting General Counsel, Deputy General Counsel, and Supervising Attorney. In December 2015, the Board of Directors appointed him as the General Counsel. Along with a team of attorneys and inspectors who conduct comprehensive inspections of Capitol Hill buildings and grounds, Mr. Ulman ensures legislative branch compliance with health and safety and public access laws incorporated in the Congressional Accountability Act of 1995. Mr. Ulman is also responsible for investigating and enforcing violations of the labor laws in the CAA. Mr. Ulman, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chair Kilmer, Vice Chair Timmons, and other members of the Select Committee. Thank you for this opportunity to speak with you today about ADA access issues in the House. I've been asked to briefly summarize the findings from the report we jointly prepared with the Architect of the Capitol and the House Sergeant at Arms pursuant to the House resolution passed during the last Congress at the behest of this committee. I think to better understand this report, let me kind of briefly describe the barrier identification and removal process that's currently in place. The current system has been in place for about 11 years. Pursuant to the CAA, my office inspects all legislative branch facilities on the Hill for ADA access issues and reports those findings to stakeholders. Under this system, we systematically inspect the facilities and provide the periodic reports. We also conduct special inspections at the request of members, employees, employing offices, and visitors, and we also then investigate specific charges of discrimination, alleged denial of access to a program, service, activity, or a public accommodation because of a disability. During the past 11 years, we've inspected almost all of the public facilities on the campus, which has, as you probably know, 18 million square feet of building space and 460 acres of surrounding grounds. We have meticulously identified and recorded in our database each barrier to access, reported those findings to the Architect of the Capitol and other employing offices, and summarized these findings in periodic reports to Congress. Under this barrier identification and removal approach, we evaluate the facilities using the 2010 standards for accessible design, which are based on guidelines developed by the Access Board and are the most recent standards. These standards, for the most part, apply to new construction and alterations. So there are, some challenges when you apply them to existing buildings. We use the standards really for planning purposes so that as a facility is altered or refurbished, it is gradually brought up to the standards to the extent feasible. And of course, here we have some very old historic buildings that are essentially living museums that must also function as office space and also maintain a high level of security. So that what we find is that in our buildings that we have to consider both the historic preservation interests as well as the potential security interests when we're looking at improving accessibility. But under this system, we have identified most, if not all, of the physical access barriers existing on the Hill, and provided those findings to the Architect of the Capitol and other employing offices, together with a possible solution for each of these barriers. Moving to the report that we issued last Congress, first of all, I think there is some good news in that report. The inspectors were, I think, impressed with the renovations taking place in the Cannon building. I think that once those renovations are complete, we will see a great improvement in accessibility in this building. Also, I think the report did note that there have been many barriers removed in Congress. I think most notably, have been the improvement in the Independence Avenue entrance to Rayburn. I think the new lift there is much a bigger improvement over what we had before. We've also seen an improvement kind of in the balcony area of Rayburn, which is often used for public gatherings, at least for the lift there is greatly improved. The not so good news is, of course, we found over 1,600 barriers to access in-house facilities. A good chunk of those barriers were in member offices at 466, and many of those can be solved fairly easily by removing or replacing furniture, moving around or putting in self-service racks at accessible levels, keeping both sides of double leaf doors open. Another kind of large chunk of the barriers are 532 were in multi-user restrooms. So again, some of these can be solved and have been solved fairly quickly by moving fixtures and dispensers, adding door pulls. Other solutions are more complicated and require reconfiguring the design of the stalls or the fixtures. So we also saw some facility-wide barriers, such as door hardware that cannot be grasped easily with one hand. In the report, we also attempted to give you a functional accessibility assessment. This type of assessment can help to identify potential access issues that are not found by referencing the standards. For example, while the 2010 standards will allow us to assess whether a restroom identified as accessible has any barriers, the standards will not tell us whether the number of accessible restrooms or their distribution is convenient or adequate. So some of the functional accessibility findings are, I think, not surprising based on the testimony you've heard so far. I mean, the current distribution and number of accessible restroom and family restrooms is not convenient for many users. The current directional signage and directories are often confusing, difficult to read, or inadequate. Access to the buildings is affected by the topography of the hill, obviously, including where the drop-off locations are for taxis and cars, and at the Capitol South Metro stop elevator, which leaves people at the bottom of the hill. And also, finally, movement between the buildings, the house buildings, can be difficult for those with disability impairments or mobility impairments, because often the most accessible route is outside and not well marked. And I think you heard some of the testimony about the challenges with moving through the tunnels. Finally, looking at the future in the report, the architect of the Capitol has provided a description of how it is addressing the facility access issues that were identified. Generally, barriers with the most, what we call an A severity code, which are those that affect safety concerns, are prioritized and they're removed fairly quickly. The same can be said for barriers that can be easily corrected. The B and C barriers can take more time, particularly if they involve extensive designing, planning, and funding. The ALC does consider ALC and integrate the open ADA barrier findings in its current and future projects. And the ALC is also undertaking additional studies and reports which are considering accessibility issues, including the ongoing transportation and security studies. The one suggestion that I have for the committee, because I know this committee likes to hear suggestions, and that list would be to create an ADA coordinator position in the House. This is a position that's familiar with many members of the disability community, since it is a position that's required by the regulations for state and local governments and executive branch agencies. I think someone in this position could assist in implementing the 3 recommendations that the committee set forth in the last Congress, dealing with websites and apps, House proceedings, and Capitol grounds and facilities. I think this person could help serve as a clearinghouse for information and coordinate all of the House-related ADA access efforts, which are really made by a variety of offices, which includes the AOC, CAO, OHEC, CHA, SAA, USCP, OCWR, and OCAS, the Office of Congressional Accessibility Services. So, and finally, I think that this office would complement and be consistent with the recent creation of other House offices, such as the Office of Employee Advocacy and the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. So, so again, I thank you for the opportunity to address the committee. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thanks, Mr. Ulman. And with that, we will dive into member questions. I will start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes, and we'll have myself and then Mr. Timmons. And then our order is Mr. Perlmutter, Mr. Davis, Mr. Phillips, Mr. Joyce, and then Ms. Van Duyn. My first question is for Ms. Ansley. I think it's helpful for us to just get a better feel for some of the concerns you raised. You described it as being difficult just to get the members of your organizations to Capitol Hill. Can you just describe what a typical visit entails and what's the process and what are some of the difficulties? And, I know part of the trickiness of even entering buildings in the house is just the security screenings and that type of thing. And if you can just describe that and perhaps how it relates to other secure facilities like airports or other federal offices, if there's things that we can learn or not learn from those entities.
Well, thank you, Chair Kilmer, for that question. There are a variety of barriers that certainly have to be considered, particularly for folks who may not be used to navigating Capitol Hill. So if we bring up members, that can relate to the drop-off point. Typically, a PVA is fortunate to have a van with a lift that we can drop people off, but often that is a game of Jenga, trying to find a place where you feel like you can deploy the ramp. Our driver has to get out many times to help the person on the ramp, so you need some time, some space to do that. So that begins, and then when you're looking at which is your closest office building, the most accessible entrance, that can depend on, does the person use a manual chair or a power chair as to which entrance is most accessible for them and how far they want to go, because as we mentioned several times, Capitol Hill is a hill, and that itself is an accessibility barrier. Then when you're getting into the Capitol, the security process can be varied. I have seen wheelchair users wave through without any screening at all. I have seen all the way to an invasive pat down that occurs right there in front of everyone in the security line. If you want to compare it to like a TSA screening, that kind of depends on, do you have pre-check? Do you have regular TSA? If you're just going through standard TSA, you're going to get a pretty invasive pat down in that process. But you also have the option to, if you can afford to upgrade to pre-check, then it's a different process. They're just going to swab your chair, your hands, or your feet and run it through a machine. So it can depend. I think the biggest issue with security is that it's variable, and it's not easy for wheelchair users to understand, which am I going to get? Am I going to get waved through, or am I going to get a pat down in front of all my colleagues and everybody else who happens to be watching? From there, it's trying to find where is the correct elevator, particularly if we have to go between house office buildings. If you're trying to go from Longworth to Rayburn and you're going in the main entrance of Longworth, there's one elevator that takes you down to the basement to get to Rayburn. And you have to keep calling the elevators until that particular one appears and it's got enough space in it that a wheelchair user can get in it. And then finally, when you get to the office, I have had to open the door and physically move chairs, coffee tables, all kinds of things just to literally get somebody in the door. One of our women veterans who uses a large power chair reported that when she's come to Capitol Hill, many times she ends up having her meetings in the hallway. Now, all of us have had hallway meetings if you've been on Capitol Hill, but when that's kind of your standard, because literally you cannot get in the office to navigate it, that's troublesome, particularly for a woman who has served her country and has a disability as a result.
I appreciate that concern that you're raising. Mr. Ulman, you touched on the idea of an ADA coordinator, and I just want to get a sense of how the Office of Congressional Workplace Rights coordinates with the other offices involved in solving ADA access issues, and perhaps talk about how you might envision an ADA coordinator fitting into the current structure that supports offices seeking accommodations for staff and for visitors with disabilities.
Sure. I mean, we work with other offices in a variety of different ways. I mean, for our systematic inspections, we conduct an opening conference, and we'll invite all of the stakeholders that might be interested. So that might include representatives from the architect of the Capitol, from the USCP, from might be the CAO in the House, like OHEC, the Office of Employment Council, and many times all of them are involved in our inspections because depending on the issue, it's going to be one of theirs to help solve it. So I mean, often because we work with all of the different offices, we are often right now the one that tries to communicate and kind of smooth out who's supposed to do what when it comes to inspections. And the same is true of our special inspections and our charges. I mean, generally we will again have an opening conference and bring in all the interested parties that may be able to solve the issue and really work. I mean, our focus is really future looking always. I mean, our approach to enforcement is not kind of punishment. It's more, how do we solve this issue? And often around here, it's figuring out who can do what to solve it, because it's, I think, confusing in terms of who has what responsibility. So, and I think that's where the ADA coordinator can help you a lot. I mean, especially in focusing, on all of the house issues that you pointed out in your report. I mean, you do have, separate issues with websites and with apps, and just having one point of contact is somebody who, even if somebody's having difficulty, for instance, getting out of the building because they stayed late talking to a member and the entrance they came in was closed. I mean, they could contact the ADA coordinator and that person could help them get out, get out of the.
Oops. I think we temporarily lost Mr. Ulman, but hopefully he'll come back. I'm also out of time, so let me invite Vice Chair Timmons to ask some questions. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just can't help but think about the fact that, one, Rayburn is one of the most confusing buildings ever constructed by man. And the fact that if you're only able to get in and out of one or a couple of points, how difficult it would be. I get frustrated just walking around Rayburn because I always get lost, but the thought that there's only one or two ways to get in and out of Rayburn or, any of these buildings would be just incredibly frustrating. So I think it's great that we're having these conversations because we must do better. And I appreciate everybody's work on that. Mr. Ulman, I want to welcome back. We need to work on internet too, obviously. I want to thank you for your work on these issues and your testimony today. I also want to take a moment to echo the comments of the chairman in recognizing the services that the Office of Congressional Accessibility Services provides to offices that have questions about how to accommodate staff or visitors on accessibility, as well as those wishing to visit the Capitol. They are an important and yet probably underutilized resource, and they're doing good work. And I just want to take a moment to thank them. But also, really, we need to bring focus to other offices on this to make sure that everyone knows that the services are available. And along those lines, Mr. Ulman, can you talk about? We were just talking about the ADA coordinator. How do you envision that really working? And could you share your thoughts kind of further on that?
Sure. First of all, I do think OCAS does a phenomenal job. I think David, Hawk and his folks, particularly with the Capitol building and the CVC. I mean, they really, with the resources they have, I think that they do a good job. And I don't mean to diminish that in any way by suggesting that an ADA coordinator would be useful for the House. But I think, the House has some specific challenges, the Senate does not have. I mean, the members are here, they have very short terms, a 2-year term. I think they have challenges setting up their offices, just figuring out who does what when you're setting up an office, I think is a big challenge, that members have, and you have a big turnover in staff. And just having somebody, looking out for the House's interests specifically and coordinating, just providing a clearinghouse for information in terms of how you can get assistance to do what, I think would be of great benefit. I mean, so, that's really where that recommendation comes from. I think I have spoken to the architect about it. I think they agree that would be a good person that they could also interact with, as well as OCAS, as well as Office of Employment, House Employment Council, CAO. I think it, just having one. The other thing is that, if the House wants to set a higher standard than what the ADA requires, it could do that, and using an ADA coordinator, for instance, the ADA standard doesn't require door openers. The ABA standards do, but the ADA standards don't require door openers, although the architect has put a lot of those in. But if the House decided that's going to be the standard, that the ADA coordinator could help implement that in the House.
Sure, thank you. Did you say that there's 1,600 doors that are not currently accessible? Did I?
There are quite a. I mean, if you look at the standards require, for instance, if you have double leaf doors, that both of the leaves be wide enough. So, if you look at all the number of double leaf doors, they're virtually all. None of them are needed. Now, there are some security concerns with that too. I think, the Capitol Police want members to have heavy doors, and members want to be able to close the doors quickly in the event of some type of security event, which is why I think many times when one leaf is open, So those are things that have to be worked out.
Sure. And, in the Cannon renovation, the doors are, I imagine that they're fire rated, there's security issues, and they're enormous and they're see-through. So, I mean, I cannot imagine that the glass doors that do have door openers on them, I mean, those are probably what, $50,000 to $100,000 each?
Yes. None of these, a lot of times the solutions are not inexpensive. So, yeah.
Well, I think that the United States government in our seat of power here in the Capitol probably should be leading by example and should not allow these problems to persist. So I just want to thank all the witnesses for their testimony, and we're going to do whatever we can to help on all these issues. So, Mr. Chairman, with that, I'll yield back. Thank you.
Thanks. We have a slight change in our batting order. Mr. Perlmutter had to step out for a moment for financial services. I'm gonna just, out of deference to his seniority, call on Mr. Davis and then Mr. Phillips.
Well, thank you very, very much, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the witnesses. I want to start with Ms. Ansley. In your testimony, you recommended we invest more in training Capitol Police and staff to both be more aware of individuals with disabilities and increase accommodation and assistance. I agree and think we can make great strides with simply informing staff, especially our staff assistants on the Hill, about the resources available to them through both Mr. Ulman's OCWR team and the Office of Congressional Accessibility Services. What do you think are the barriers blocking staff from being aware and taking advantage of the resources?
Thank you for the question. I think one of the barriers on the Hill is always time. It's very busy. There's lots going on. And I think, incentivizing staff to get this training by having it be something that's coming from the top, whether it's the members, it's the leadership, that this type of training is important because it helps to improve accessibility is key. And I think providing staff with easy resources so that they know what to do when they get requests, having checklists, having an understanding of, if somebody tells me that a wheelchair user is coming to this meeting, what does that mean for my office? It means I might have to move something. I might have to have the door open and ready when it's, close to time for them to arrive. I think as easy as we can make it for staff to have those resources at their fingertips, the more likely it is that they will then be able to put that into place when they're balancing 100 other things that they're trying to take care of at any one moment.
Great. Do you, or any of the witnesses for that matter, you just mentioned some sample outreach strategies that have been successfully deployed. Do you have any more that you'd be willing to share with us?
I'd be happy to comment. This is Judy Brewer.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and thank you for this question with regard to training in the digital accessibility area. We feel that it's important to look at the many different roles in an organization. So for instance, someone who's a website developer or a mobile application developer clearly needs some training as to how to apply that standard. But at the same time, you need to make sure that management has training so they have broad awareness of what the requirements are, how to achieve it, what potential barriers to uptake are, and so forth. It's helpful to have somebody at a high level who can be a champion, who's also oriented to the issue. It's also helpful to have non-technical people who have awareness of how to address accessibility in the particular form of digital accessibility. And I imagine that carries over as well to the built environment. There's a training need for the practical details, but also management need for training and so forth. And there's many resources available for that in terms of digital accessibility. So we have free open courses. There's also more specialized courses that different businesses provide.
Excellent. Well, as a ranking member of House Administration, I know both the majority and the minority on that committee would love to be able to continue to work with each and every one of you to do what we can to make sure the areas that we have oversight over continue to address some of the problems that have been brought up by all of the witnesses' testimony. And Mr. Ulman, if I could, and I apologize if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, but if I could end with some questions to you. As the architect of the Capitol performs its security assessment and undertakes its larger multi-year transportation study, is your office included in either of those conversations?
Yes. First of all, you're pronouncing my name perfectly. So, the architect. We have been very involved in the transportation study. We've had our contractor involved as well in terms of providing suggestions regarding drop-off locations and some of the access issues to the buildings themselves. We haven't been involved too much in the security study, but I expect that we will. Generally, we do get involved.
Good. Is there anything we can do at House administration or with this committee to help foster even a better relationship with the architect?
There's nothing I can think of offhand, but I'd certainly be willing to think about that question some more and get back to you or your staff about that.
Well, I've been amazed, since we run new member orientation, I've seen that the office lotto that is usually, takes all the energy out of Congress solving any other problems for at least a week. That one issue does not, I hear no complaints when we're able to make an accommodation to some of our newly elected members with disabilities. And that's a testament, because all of us want to help, and all of us want to help you help everyone else too. So with that, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Thanks, Mr. Davis. Next up, Mr. Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to thank all of you. Some wonderful propositions, most of them affirming. My real, more than a question, just more of a statement. Mr. Ulman, you spoke of the 477 barriers. My colleague, Mr. Davis, just asked how House admin can be a better liaison, perhaps. And I just want to make that proposition that, with so much low-hanging fruit, how we could easily distribute these best practices to new members and existing members at the beginning of a Congress, or frankly at any time. And that's easy. It doesn't take a lot of action, and just want to advocate for so doing. But just want to thank our witnesses and your testimony. You've elevated some important issues that we have to address, and we intend to do so. So gratitude and many thanks. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. Mr. Joyce. Sorry, Mr. Joyce, I see you. I can't hear you.
I've been listening, but I have no questions at this time, Mr. Chair.
All
I'm
right.
doing this off my phone. I apologize.
That's all right. That's all right. Then we got Ms. Williams.
Good morning, everybody. And I first want to apologize for my tardiness. Right at the start of this hearing, I got a call that a constituent and a county commissioner in my district passed away, who I just spent the entire day with Saturday. So I had to get myself together but I'm here now. For the committee, I apologize if my questions are redundant. This was a topic that I really wanted to hear more about and dig into. And so, Mr. Ulman, I think I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Perfect. I know that my constituents coming from Georgia, we're hundreds of miles away, and it's already enough of a travel to get here for that distance, but we have so many other barriers that in your testimony you reference, of even when you get to the Capitol, that people still have to deal with just getting around the Capitol complex. And you mentioned 1,632 accessibility barriers in House buildings alone. And one of them includes the multiple barriers in member offices. And some of those can be easily resolved. How do you recommend that our offices proactively prevent or identify and eliminate the barriers within our own spaces, our individual offices?
Well, we actually do have some guidelines on our website. We've got a video kind of directed at member offices specifically. We've got some checklists. We worked with both employment council on both the House side and the Senate side to come up with checklists to be used in district offices as well, just to think about ADA access. So we do, you know, we do our best to publicize that those resources are available. You know, we don't have, you know, access to the internal network at the House, but we do have it on our website. So that's a great place to start. Also, you know, our office is always available for any consultation. We have consulted with members before who are looking at, you know, specific issues in their house or even in district offices, and we've worked through how they can solve those. So we do have that resource available to you. So.
And Mr. Ulman, I'm wondering if any of this has come up as a resource issue that, like, in making modifications in offices, if that has been a challenge, and if so, like, what do you think needs to be done so that we can tackle that, advocate for the resources to get some of these issues fixed, and then to also advocate for fixing the more complex issues around the Capitol as well?
Yeah. Well, you know, the big challenge in member offices is how tight the space is, you know, and so, you know, we work on the areas that the public come in so that at least there's access to a conference room with a table that's at an accessible height. You know, we encourage them not to have to move around furniture, that it's always in that position, so it's inviting to people who come in. There's no easy solution to getting members more space. You know, I don't think. But the one thing I think that we're learning from the pandemic is, you know, that Zoom is a good resource, and that more and more of staff work can be done probably remotely. I think Hill has been somewhat slow in doing that. That potentially could at least free up some space in the office where you don't have to have staff in every day or something, or alternate when staff comes in. So that, you know, that may be maybe not the ideal solution, but certainly a less expensive solution to do that. I think the resource issues, I mean, you know, obviously the AOC prioritizes, you know, there are ongoing maintenance issues in all of the facilities, as well as safety issues, as well as ADA access issues. And I think the AOC, you know, does a good job providing to appropriations their list of projects and what's going to be funded and not, and leaves it up to appropriations to decide, you know, what's going to be funded and not funded. You know, so it's really a matter of getting the ADA access, you know, programs a higher priority and get them funded. So.
Thank you. And I mean, just my opinion, I don't think ADA access should be up for if we fund it or not. Like, that should be a must-have on the priority list. So, and finally, I have a few seconds left. You also advocate for the creation of a House designated ADA coordinator to facilitate the accessibility of Congress, both physically and virtually. Do you envision any role for the coordinator in proactively reaching out to congressional offices to share accessibility best practices? I know you mentioned it was on the website, but I haven't seen this. And so that is something that I need to be more proactive about. Right. But how can we be more proactive with members of Congress to make sure that we have that information?
Yeah, certainly that really is one of the primary roles of an ADA coordinator, is to, you know, work with offices. There's mention of training. That's something that training can be provided, you know, all of those things. And by having it located in the House and having access to the House net, you know, which is, I think, where most members get their information. If there's a big presence there with those resources, I think more members are going to be aware of what resources are available. And of course, that person can also direct you to the other resources that are available, either, you know, to the Office of Congressional Accessibility Services, or to our office, or to the Office of House Employment Council. So I think that's why I think the coordinator might be beneficial too. So.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Chairman, my apologies. I did go over just a few seconds.
No apology necessary, and we're glad you're here, and I'm sorry to hear about your loss. I want to give members an opportunity if they have additional questions. I have a round 2 question, and it's for Ms. Ball. I was hoping you could just explain the onboarding process in your office. What accommodations were made? was there a point person in your office? Who was it that they worked through, in some of the other departments like CAO and HIR and payroll and benefits?
Sure. Thank you very much for that question. Obviously, some of that was sort of behind the scenes as I was being onboarded. So I'll try and answer the question as best I can. Liz Hollis in our office was really the point person, and she reached out to me very early on. Obviously they had seen in the interview that I was a wheelchair user, and so they were, aware of that and wanted to make sure that everything was accessible to me. And Liz literally asked me for, the dimensions of my wheelchair and different things like that, so that they could go through my, figure out which office was going to work best for me, which furniture I might need. And also one thing I really appreciated was they made sure that the common spaces that the staff work in were going to be accessible to me, so that I wouldn't be sort of relegated to staying in my office. And I haven't had any particular issues navigating those spaces. In terms of paying for things, I didn't really need any particular accommodation. Actually, they did have a desk that was made. Unfortunately, it ended up not working for me because I usually get out of my wheelchair and sit in a regular chair when I'm at work. So, but they did go through the architect of the Capitol, is my understanding, to acquire that. And their efforts were very much appreciated. And I certainly felt like that was something that there was a real information exchange, which I think is the important thing, is that universal access is great, but a lot of times a person with a disability might need specific accommodations. And so, having a conversation with that person and asking what's going to meet their needs is really the most important part of the process. And they absolutely did that.
And you may have just spoken to this, but did your employing office did they spend the money to get equipment and furniture, or was it provided by the house?
Again, I didn't really need a whole lot of extras just because of the nature of my disability. I'm able to use most regular things. I can stand up some, so that means that I don't have some of the same accessibility needs as other folks do. In terms of the desk that they did have made, I believe that just came out of the committee's budget. And one thing I'd like to point out about that, I mean, I am absolutely for allocating more resources to making things accessible, but under the ADA, employers are responsible for making the environments that their staff are in accessible regardless. And there's no particular funding available for that other than tax incentives and things like that. So it's just part of doing business. And I think that that's something that that's an attitude that needs to be really prevalent in the House as well. And again, it was certainly the case on the committee I work for. I think Mr. Ulman makes a very good point that there's so much turnover just in terms of members being here for a relatively short period of time. Sometimes they may not have that kind of awareness of all of their responsibilities as employers.
Thank you. Let me invite, did any other members of the committee have a round 2 question? I think I see only nodding heads or shaking heads. Okay. Well, with that, I want to thank all of our witnesses for their testimony today. I really appreciated your perspectives and think you gave our committee a lot to chew on. So thank you for that. As I'm issuing gratitude, I also want to just thank our staff for putting this hearing together. The select committee has a terrific team that is doing great work pulling together, I think, some really insightful hearings. So thank you for that too. So with that, without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which we forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. And with that, this hearing is adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.